With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
For The World Today, this is James O'Neill. Peace talks over a U.S. proposed plan to end the nearly 4-year Ukraine war continue constructively in Florida, according to Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev, with Ukrainian President Zelensky stating they were moving quickly. Dmitriev met U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner as part of the Trump administration's broader diplomatic push following meetings in Berlin. However, Moscow and Kyiv remain far apart, with President Putin insisting Russia will achieve its aims if Ukraine does not accept Russian conditions. France welcomed Putin's openness to speaking with President Macron. Meanwhile, Ukraine accused Russian forces of abducting about 50 civilians from the Sumy region. Before dawn on December 20th, the U.S. Coast Guard and the Department of War seized the oil tanker Centuries in international waters off Venezuela, accusing its operators of transporting sanctioned crude used to fund narco-terror networks. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem released video of a Coast Guard helicopter boarding the tanker, part of President Trump's naval blockade of Venezuela, after designating its government a foreign terrorist organization. U.S. officials said the ship, flying a Panamanian flag, was likely bound for Asia. Venezuela condemned the operation as theft, claiming the crew had been forcibly disappeared. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said the blockade will remain until Maduro returns every stolen American asset. Growing discussion of an impending war has collided with widespread skepticism among young Britons, many of whom question why they should fight for a government they feel has undermined their interests. Polling shows nearly half of Britons say they would never take up arms, with especially low willingness among young adults. Major British newspapers now openly debate whether the state can rely on a fragmented multicultural society for mass mobilization. Military figures insist citizens must be prepared to support national defense, including potential conscription, while critics argue Britain's identity, social cohesion, and governance have eroded too severely to inspire such loyalty. A massive power outage on Saturday left 130,000 homes and businesses in San Francisco without electricity after a fire at a PG&E substation near 8th and Mission Streets. Roughly 30% of the city went dark, affecting neighborhoods from Richmond and the Presidio to Haight-Ashbury and Pacific Heights. The blackout disabled traffic lights, halted public transit, closed shops, and caused autonomous vehicles to stall in streets because they could not detect unpowered signals, creating widespread gridlock. The Department of Emergency Management warned of significant transit disruptions and urged residents to avoid travel. By 4 p.m., PG&E said the grid had stabilized and no further outages were expected. 3 men will stand trial next year after a silver steward at the Élysée Palace was arrested for stealing silverware and table service worth 15,000 to 40,000 euros. The disappearance was reported by the head steward, and items were later found listed on online auction sites. Investigators traced the thefts to a silver steward, whose inventory records suggested planned future thefts and who was romantically linked to a woman selling tableware online. About 100 items were recovered from his locker, vehicle, and home. All 3 suspects were arrested. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was loudly booed and heckled at Bondi Beach while attending a memorial for victims of the Hanukkah night terrorist attack that killed 15 people. Critics shouted shame, blood on your hands, and you are not welcome, accusing his government of failing to curb rising anti-Semitism. Albanese has faced mounting pressure after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he ignored warnings ahead of the massacre. Past footage resurfaced showing Albanese at a pro-Palestine rally and visiting Yasser Arafat in 1998.
You are not welcome! You don't represent Australia! You don't represent Australia! Get out of here, Albanese!
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today.
There is a problem with medicine, and we can explain what it is by looking back to the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin, it turns out, was not just an accidental finding. Alexander Fleming discovered that mold he found in a culture dish was killing bacteria, but it took over 10 years before a team at Oxford University were able to isolate the active ingredient. They produced small quantities for preclinical and clinical trials, helping prove the compound was safe and could beat infection. However, they couldn't produce it at scale. In 1941, Andrew Jackson Moyer of the US Department of Agriculture, the forerunner to the FDA, suggested changes to the manufacturing process, enabling mass production. It turns out medicines are not invented when someone discovers a new molecular entity. They are the product of key stakeholders working together collaboratively. Until medicine can be manufactured at scale, it may as well not exist. And in 2025, this is a problem. In the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began outsourcing production. Suddenly the system was significantly less integrated. Someone with a new discovery today will find themselves disconnected from the rest of the development and manufacturing process. Companies that develop medicine are still happy to work with big established pharma companies, but the modern day Flemings are cut out of the system. The result is far fewer new medicines coming to market. We want to fix this by ensuring the pharma industry builds a more integrated supply chain. We also believe that doctors' expertise administering medicine should be included at the beginning of the process. We know that doctors on the front line have insights about how to repurpose medicine. Doctors should be able to report their findings so that the necessary testing can be completed and they can share their results worldwide. Learn more here and help us take medicines back to the future.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, the world today.
What we have overwhelmingly is discussions about what to do after the horse has bolted. This has to be a case of don't buy the horse. You've got to be a lot more stringent and come forward with how you select people to come to Australia, what is the process of how you do it, and have a greater period of basically, where you haven't been given citizenship and we're watching it, and also a clear contractual relationship of if we have from a certain area for whatever reason an inordinate number or a higher proportion than you would expect of problems, then we have to do the right thing by the Australian people and say, no, until things settle down there or until there's a change of mind or a change of view, we can't be bringing in immigrants from that part of the world. I think the Australian people want something definitive. What we are seeing is a lot of statements of the bleeding obvious, a lot of platitudes, and a lot of, when this this is what we're going to do if someone's involved with hate speech. Okay, yes, absolutely. The question you got to ask prior to that is, why is there someone in Australia who's indulging in hate speech? Where did this person who is indulging in hate speech come from? What is the aspect, the cultural aspect that sits behind that, which is completely at odds with the Australian culture? We are not a multicultural society. We are a culture, an Australian culture, and you have to abide by it. Now, Mr. Albanese is in trouble. There is a real sense out there that he's not up to the job.
Well, I think that's now becoming clear. It's interesting. The last immigration minister I heard talk in the way that you're suggesting was the late Kevin Andrews, this many years ago, who suggested slowing down immigration from certain African countries, given the difficulty of minorities from that country integrating here, crime rates and things like that. He was blasted, Barnaby, as you well know, as a racist. And since then, we've imported people, including 5 Muslim refugees who committed terrorist attacks on our soil. I don't think we've learned the lesson of what you're talking about. Why is that? Why has there been a reluctance to at least publicly say immigration from these particular countries will be limited until we can prove that we can properly settle the majority, most of them that are here already?
And that's what other countries do, by the way. Other countries, outrageous countries such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Korea, it's not something new. These are both Islamic countries and suppose Shinto countries and Buddhist countries. I mean, there are other places in the world that do precisely this. And the reason they do it is maybe they're just a lot more aware of the problems you can have. Now, it's really a contractual basis for that. If you come to Australia, you are not only a representation of yourself, you're a representation of where you come from. You're a representation of that culture of where you come from. And you have to understand that there is a period of observation. In some instances, it should be a long period of observation to say, okay, that works in harmony with what Australia is. And if there's a sort of discordant, vitriolic process. Remember what we saw the other day is people, mass murderers who hate Australia. They did say and it's sort of even now we've got this sort of weird amalgam of it's about a Jewish other people thing. No, it's absolutely about Jewish. It's an absolute, but it's people. I mean, would there be a different reaction to this by Mr. Albanese if they'd gone to Leichhardt and killed, I don't know, a whole heap of Italian people, or gone down to Botany and killed a whole heap of Greek, or gone out of the country to Walgett and killed a whole heap of Aboriginals? I mean, just the fact that that is happening in Australia is bizarre. It's an outrage. And of course, that causes us that we have to do something that's way beyond what we've done in the past, because what we've done in the past is not working.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people are saying that one of the heroes of Bondi was a Muslim man who tackled unarmed one of the gunmen, incredibly brave. All credit to him. 3 Jews also did the same. They were killed. But I have to point out that hero of Bondi, a very, very popular Palestinian website in the Palestinian Authority, there's been a survey done, and most of the readers who comment on it are calling him a traitor and hate him. So there's something over there that's in the water that I don't know that we need to import. I asked Barnaby, I said, the Prime Minister's finished. He should go. It's easy to say that, and you know how politics works. There's a Christmas break coming up. The Prime Minister will no doubt try to wait it out. He'll then hope people have moved on, and then, politics back to normal. Do you think it's going to work like that again, or is he finished? Has something snapped?
I think something has snapped. And as we speak tonight, Andrew, Hizb ut-Tahrir is still legal in Australia. As we speak tonight, the Islamic Brotherhood is still legal in Australia. As we speak tonight, not one piece of legislation has been through any house in both the federal or the state levels to deal with this. As we speak tonight, no one's been called back to Parliament. I mean, as we speak tonight, Andrew, to be quite frank, not much has happened at all.
Well, there's been a press conference. I mean, I've got to say, Barnaby, I find it ironic that the Prime Minister's given press conferences calling for unity, standing in front of 3 flags. I mean, a symbol of a division that I think he's really got to reflect on far more broadly than he has to date. Barnaby Joyce, thank you so much for your time.
And welcome. Thanks for joining us. Just before Christmas, a couple of sleeps before Santa comes, and maybe he'll bring you a bottle of scotch. Who knows? Make sure you're old enough to drink it, or don't tell your parents. Whatever the case is, welcome to The Big Issue. I'm Mike Ryan. Thank you very much for joining us. What's gone wrong in Australia? Why are we here? And is there a cancer eating away our country and our way of life that can't be cured? I certainly hope not. The terror inflicted on our community a week ago was perpetrated by 2 individuals known to police. Why weren't they regarded as a threat that they were? Are there others like them? At the moment, we don't know, or if we do know from the police point of view, they're not telling us. But perhaps we should know. No Australian should be in danger of being mown down in a visit to a beach or a suburban shopping mall. Smaller but deadly events are happening more and more in this country. If you look at drive-by shootings, they all have guns. If you look at a lot of the arrests of late, they're assassins. Can you believe it? Small assassin gangs carrying guns. Are these, and think about it, are these events related? At the moment, we don't know, but many of us are guessing or playing, let's join the dots. And that's not quite right. We need to know. Politicians have not explained a thing. Instead, of the past week, they and various tribes have spoken out on what is needed to prevent horrific events such as what happened at Bondi. However, many of the measures hurriedly announced under pressure do no more than deflect and protect the standing of our politicians. In addition, little has been said by our so-called leaders and elder statesmen on the cargo cult of multiculturalism and ever-rising immigration levels imposed by narrow electoral interest, powerful business lobbies, and those international organisations. Our politicians now must demonstrate that they're capable of addressing the issue of terror in this country. They should be managing real risk rather than restricting the rights of the innocent to speak, criticise, and protest. What innocent Australians must do now is wake up, take notice of what's happening around the globe, and somehow force our government to refrain from dabbling in senseless and unending wars and implement policies that truly support Australian values and long-term prosperity. We have two eminent guests who will have their own views on how we can stop terrorism and make this a safer country. Can they give us hope? I certainly hope so. And I certainly hope there's a way we can. Robert Gregory is the CEO of the Australian Jewish Association and the Honorary Dr. Gary Johns from Close the Gap Research. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Can I ask, Robert, is there a problem of ISIS in this country, which is known as the Muslim Brotherhood? It is a problem in most countries, or all countries that they're set up in, and just look at the UK, for example. In your opinion, in Australia, do we have a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood?
I think we do. We've seen ever since October 7 in the response, some of the rallies we've seen ISIS flags on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and flags of various terrorist groups. So there hasn't been enough government monitoring of the Muslim Brotherhood, groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir that security agencies have been calling to ban for many years, that many countries in the world have banned. Instead, we've seen the government giving large grants to some radical organizations. So I just don't think there's been enough focus from the government on this. And I think, of course, I mean, we have a large Muslim population, and we're talking about a very, very small percentage of that are involved in these extremist groups. But even that very small percentage is enough to pose a large security risk.
Gary Johns, tell me, is there a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood in this country? Because what we're seeing is this, and I've never felt such tension, or this not underwhelming, but almost bubbling under, almost hatred for our fellow Australians. And these are, we have, I mean, everybody at the moment, it's a bit like COVID, everybody became an epidemiologist or a immunologist. And at the moment, we all have an opinion on why multiculturalism really isn't working. And I mean, I just don't know how we can fix it. So is there a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood? Do we have a this bubbling down under that's already has reared its ugly head? And how do we fix it?
Mike, it's good that we each have an opinion. We should speak freely. That's the first line of defence. And I think for a number of years, it was difficult to speak about the issues that now need to be spoken of. I don't have a problem, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood as such or Hizb ut-Tahrir as such are the problem. It's the number of Australians who are susceptible to their message. And we need to ask the question, how many Australians were sympathetic with those vile actions of last Sunday week? And I suspect there'd be thousands. So I'd like to concentrate it, if you like, on the minds of those who were sympathetic to the horrible events of last Sunday week where 15 Jewish Australians were murdered. So it's a slightly broader issue. It's not that there is a group with a name on it or a particular flag, black and white, waving in the breeze. It's the sort of person resident in Australia today who thinks that their objects are perfectly reasonable. That's what worries me.
And it is an issue because you bring up a good point, Gary. We often have been described as being on the edge when we were TNT and now, but we always, as you said, we have to talk. We're always invited people to come on from both sides to have their say and provide a point of view. Whether we agreed or not, we thought it was important that everybody needed to have that right of reply and that right of having an opinion, providing it wasn't too over the top. We did have some of those, but you're right. The baying for blood from and when sure we're talking about the Jewish community, but we're a multicultural country. So as the baying for blood from one group of Australians to another group of Australians, it's almost, it is like this cancer on steroids, isn't it, Robert?
I think it is, and I think we heard in the introduction that you played that one of the areas that needs to be focused on is immigration, and that's going to be one of the ways, whether it needs to be a pause, whether it needs to be stricter checks. But I think we're importing a problem that until quite recently we didn't really have in Australia, and unless there's a big focus, and we can't allow the government to go off on tangents and focus on areas which are not the source of the problem. They're always imagining there's right-wing extremism everywhere, and they think there's big groups of Nazis that they need to focus on banning. When there's a small problem there, and it needs to be taken care of, but the government's diverting attention away from these really serious threats to the social cohesion in Australia. And unfortunately, we've seen the results of Bondi Beach 1 week ago.
Gary, I just want to ask you, like COVID to an extent, but now it's sort of enhanced a lot. The discussions between groups seems to have been stifled, and if you look at all the measures talked about so far, nothing has been done. But the measures talked about on social media and whatever, the hate speech and stuff. Surely I would have thought that this is the moment where we say, okay, open up. Let's talk about exactly what is on your mind. Let's work out a solution instead of saying you can't talk about the things that are irking you or that are concerning you. And so therefore, if you can't talk about them, you can't really solve the issue because you haven't spoken about the issue. Why does Australia have this thing about, and it does of late, it has a thing about having a open communication, a candid conversation with your fellow Australians. We don't seem to like that a whole lot. Is more talk required, or do you think we've done too much talk?
Well, traditionally the places where talk would take place are in churches, and there's a problem there because we have two religious groups who are literally at war with each other, although the Jews not so much with Muslims as the Muslims with the Jews, I might say, and Muslims with Christians. So the churches, I think, have not played the part that they might have, particularly the Christian churches, to provide a forum for the necessary discussions, because I think too many of the churches, I'm thinking particularly the Anglican and Uniting Church here, are just so left-wing. They really don't want a conversation. They would prefer to have the sort of niceties that are padded out by the ABC and by many of the universities. So universities, the ABC, SBS, and a number of our churches are the places that should be providing forums where we can have these conversations, but we haven't been able to have them for maybe a generation. And that's why I think we're feeling quite constrained in our discussion.
I have to ask about our intelligence, intel, Robert. The ASIO and our counter-terror policies don't seem to be working, do they?
Well, they don't. And the fact that at least one of these individuals was on the radar of ASIO at some point and they were still able to acquire these guns and what happened was able to happen is obviously an intelligence failure. And before we go too hard on the intelligence agencies, we need to find out just how many people are they monitoring. I mean, if there's thousands of people in this category, then we can hardly expect them to monitor them all 24/7. Do they need more resources? This is all why a Royal Commission is important, to find out what went wrong, why were there these failures, because there were intelligence failures, and there also seem to have been policing failures on the day. Why were there only 2 police for 1,000 people in this raised climate, knowing that threats were possible? So we need to look into everything that went wrong and find out how we can prevent things like this happening again.
I want to ask you, Gary, your views on our intel, our ASIO, and I know in the US, I think in the UK, MI6 does out of the borders, and MI5 does within. I've got the impression, and maybe you can point me on the right track here, that ASIO in Australia is both within and outside, unless the federal police do the within the borders and ASIO does the outside threats. I'm not sure, but regardless, it didn't work, did it?
Well, you can't say that. ASIO, who in fact look internally, may have stopped multiple potential murders and incidents. So I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a good thing if they had not stopped last Sunday week, of course not. But I think we can appreciate that ASIO have in fact been very active, but Robert's quite correct here. Do they have the resources to track, I think, the thousands, possibly tens of thousands of people that they need to track? Well, look, what worries me about the whole business of the Royal Commission is that it may well get stuck in this rabbit hole of ASIO and how many spies we should have and what resources, blah, 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 blah. And the same thing will happen with the inquiry that the Prime Minister and Cabinet will probably undertake. I think these are a deflection. They can get on with their work. Each of us could write a brief for it now. What we need is a broader discussion about how is it that we import the enemy? How is it that we allow people into the country with such hatred in their hearts and or are susceptible to such hate-filled ideas? That inevitably comes to the question of immigration, and that's not a simple solution at all, because we need to have a conversation that says we welcome people with open arms, but this is the contract. I mean, these are the reasons why you come, and this is the deal. And even if we don't get it right immediately, we need to talk about it constantly. So there's an expectation, and that's going to take 2 generations to solve, because we're 2 generations down the track from when there was an assumption towards integration in the Australian immigration program, which was blown out of the water in about 1972 from memory. So there we go. There's some long-term things that we have to have take place, and we want changes that will stick across governments, Labor and coalition. They've got to stick over a long, long time. Now that's partly a matter of negotiation, partly a matter of let's try some changes to immigration. It can't be Muslims are banned, right? We've got Indonesia just to the north of us. But it can be if we're not satisfied, if an Australian delegate of the Minister of Immigration offshore is not satisfied that a person can fit into this society, then they reject the application. And we should be quite tough about that. That would slow down immigration. I'm not saying that's necessarily the object, but we are entitled to choose who comes to Australia. So let's start making some choices. Even if we don't get it right immediately, we should at least signal that we're having the conversation, that Australians feel uncomfortable. And we won't get it right immediately, and it may take a generation or two, but let's have that conversation.
Can I ask you also, Robert, when the Prime Minister came out, he first of all, he blamed the far right, always the far right, right-wing extremist. Can you, I mean, and truly, if I ever hear another politician, oh, it's a far right, they're all extremist. What were your views? You know, that was in his initial address to the nation. He was blaming the far right, and as you can see, it's far wrong. It was not the far right. When a situation like this happens, and the politicians, and both sides, by the way, it's not just Labor, it's both sides, far right, people that used to work for us, it's the far right. Do you think we're missing the point?
Yeah, I think we've seen an exercise in deflection here. First, the Prime Minister blamed the far right. At the moment, he's now blaming firearms owners. But there was no mention of radical Islam in that initial statement. He's had to correct that. So if we can't call out the problem, then we've got no hope of fixing it. On Gary's point that the immigration is going to be one of the areas, and the minister needs to have the authority to reject people. I think the problem is we've got the fox in charge of the hen house here, because Tony Burke, as minister, has brought in, Australia is bringing in the most people from Gaza of any country in the world. The minister met people at the airport to welcome them. Now, we know they're coming from a war zone where the necessary security checks have not been done. And this is also the same minister who's been refusing visas to various visitors that he doesn't like, who he considers far right, well-known people. Even my own organization, we were bringing an Israeli politician, and the immigration minister cancelled the visa. So if the government's not focused on the priorities, and one of the priorities needs to be radical Islam, we have a big problem. The far right, look, there's people on the far right and the far left who are dangerous. There always has been, and it's something we need to look at. But we're talking about a small amount of people, and an attack like this it has nothing to do with the far right. So when the government rushes in measures, and you can see these are the measures they've wanted to bring in for a long time, cracking down on speech, cracking down on guns. They're just using this terrible tragedy as an excuse to pass these laws.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just want to know also, Gary, your views on politicians, far right. I mean, you're a politician, you were a politician, you saw the light, you got out amongst the real people, but it's a far right or the far left. It's nothing to do with the far right or the far left. In this particular instant, it's to do with two murdering mongrels, and that's what they were. And if you look at the Brotherhood, part of their mantra is to create division and unrest. They do a magnificent job in many countries. Look at the UK, for example. So the politicians reaching for their how to reply to a terrorist attack 101. We'll say the far right is pretty poor, isn't it? And you would expect more. I know he's of your ilk, but you would expect more from any prime minister to speak a little more intelligently and do away with the far right sort of garbage.
Well, I'm not expecting much at all from our prime minister, not to speak intelligently at all. My expectations of him have drifted lower and lower across 4 years. But let me say no more of him. The far right consists in this country of 20 young blokes in black T-shirts and shorts. I mean, they're a joke. I don't think they are a significant risk to Australians. They're play acting. The risk to Australians is from the left, from the acceptable left. even our Foreign Minister Penny Wong feels comfortable on constantly talking about the rights of Palestinians to, in effect, a one-party state. She may be talking about a two-state solution, but the people she is supporting in that want one state, one that no Jew exists in Israel. So she knows that, and Albanese knows that, and Burke knows that. So to be more particular, and to Robert's point, we have to be very careful about bringing in people from war zones. You see, it was I think we called it the Lebanese or Lebanon concession in the 1970s when Malcolm Fraser allowed southern Lebanese to come in. And they're mainly very ignorant, rural Muslim people who constitute the body of organised crime in southwest Sydney 2 generations on. So you've got to be very careful that you allow a mindset into a country that even in the second generation can deteriorate badly. People who don't fit in feel angry, especially young men, and don't know how to, if you like, win their place in society. I'm not quite sure why it's our job to help them integrate. I'd rather we keep out those who we think and judge are less likely than others to integrate. There are lots of people who want to come to Australia. Let's be more selective. And Tony Burke to allow in people that he had, 3,000 from Gaza is a disgrace. The ISIS brides who he claimed he wasn't assisting, but is a disgrace. We can have those conversations. Let's have them. Let's talk about who gets in and who doesn't. And just to add a note on the end of that, the Netherlands is now being very strong in who they allow into the Netherlands, and they have. I forget the name. I think it's an integration act, but essentially you have to prove that you can integrate into Dutch society before they let you in, and you need almost the equivalent of a certificate 4 in reading, writing, speaking the Dutch language before you get in. I'd like to see something as comprehensive as that.
I'll just keep you while you're there. The amount of restrictions, gun control, Minns wants to do away with, for a while, protest. We have your freedom of speech being curtailed, which is subjective to a few people or to algorithms, and so on. Does it worry you that, because once upon a time, the Labor Party, and I recall Bob Hawke. In fact, I interviewed Bob Hawke, which was an experience and a half, but I interviewed him, and we had Paul Keating, who I had a chat to, and it was always the party of hope and respecting people's individual rights. And in those days, the Conservatives were a bit fuddy-duddy and a bit too establishment. It seems like there's no separating both parties at the moment, but they're all pretty keen to curtail our basic rights and freedoms. As an ex-politician, Gary, how does that sit with you?
Well, panic can set in, can't it? I mean, we saw that, for instance, in the COVID-19 response. Panic set in. You have to be seen to be in control. So the worry now over the Jewish murders is that panic sets in. So we need those spaces for the broader discussion. Don't let the politicians get away with the deflections of inquiries and the gun buybacks. Let's have a discussion about the enemy within, those who are among us, and how are we going to deal with them? My view is pretty simple. We need to hug Muslim people living in Australia, meaning let's be friends, and spy on them. In fact, we are doing both of those, but we cannot in future allow our immigration numbers grow where we think the risk is of more people who will be our enemies, whether they are Islamists or not, but that's an obvious clue. So hug, spy, and control immigration are my sort of three elements.
Robert, what do you think? I mean, all these restrictions are talking about. By the way, nothing has happened. I played an old video. No, it was a little bit old. I think it was from Friday, of Andrew Bolt talking with Barnaby Joyce, and of that night, no one had sat extra hours in Parliament. They hadn't recorded. Nothing has happened. It was all talk. So, if we have the all talk thing, the next step would be the all talk will become quite silent and nothing will really happen. Or do you think something will happen, something should happen? But the problem is, if you bring in all these restrictions, again, even though it was a terrible thing, they're going to be pointing the finger, one at the government, saying it's, how dare they? And then they're going to be pointing the fingers at particular nationalities or cultural groups or religious groups in Australia, saying, look what you've done to my country. We actually, and Gary's right, we do need to have a very measured and level-headed conversation and to move forward, because the last thing I think any religion or culture would want, or except for maybe Islam, and I'm not being overtly critical here, but most religions and cultures want you to have that freedom, that right to reply, that right to have a conversation, the right to travel, all that sort of stuff. And if government starts bringing in all these measures in the protection of all Australians, what's the point of being alive?
Yeah, I think that's right. The two things we want to avoid is the government just making this a talk fest and going on and no results. And we also want to avoid hasty, rushed responses. And that's been what we've seen so far from this government. They did nothing until we saw a spate of fire bombings and attacks last year, and they rushed into measures. Then they took a long break, did nothing, and now we've seen this terrible attack, and they're going to rush in some more measures. So I think these broad measures, cracking down on speech, cracking down on people's rights, on firearms, are not the way to go. I do support some measures, but they need to be quite targeted. So not just hate speech. The only speech that should be illegal, that should be banned, is directly threatening violence. And unfortunately, we've seen some of that, these threats to kill, threats to violence that have not been dealt with appropriately. So there are certain phrases that are used, calling for death, calling for intifada, that I think should be banned, but it needs to be done in a very focused way and only on those areas, not just a general bans on speech that may be offensive or insulting. We need to make sure we're very focused.
Gary, I just want to pick you up on one thing before. You said we need to hug and then hug our a lot of the immigrants and then surveil them. Do we really need that surveillance at the moment, or have we gone down the slippery path such as the UK and throughout Europe and other parts of the world?
No, ASIO is spying on our citizens, on those they suspect are a risk to us. So have no doubt about that. The only question is whether they have sufficient resources or they're sufficiently good at what they do. Just to pop back to the issue you said that Parliament might be recalled, I think that would have been a good thing, because part of this game is to reassert a sense that our representatives can speak for us. I think too often we speak through groups. I didn't like the idea that we have an ambassador for Islam and an ambassador for the Jews in Australia. We should have had a parliamentary committee taking evidence from all sorts of people and all sorts of representatives. I think this becomes too much of a narrow game. A couple of representatives appointed by a Prime Minister talking to a Prime Minister, and I think the whole Parliament should be involved. Let's have open discussion by members of Parliament in the forum. There doesn't need to be a law passed at the end of it at all. We use the forum. Let's reclaim one of our great institutions, which is the forum of the Parliament, the House of Representatives, the floor, the Senate, the floor. That could be a good thing. It's possibly too late now because the Prime Minister has let it slide by.
I just want to ask Robert, if you wouldn't mind, his views on the Gillian Siegel report, some of the good points and the bad points, and just as a part B to that, we hear a lot about anti-Semitism, and sometimes I think personally people do get if you criticise a particular government, such as the Australian government, you're not anti-Australian. If you criticise the American government, you probably get a medal for it. If you criticise the Brits, they're probably the same thing. But I think all governments need to be criticised. But there seems to be at times, and I'd like to know your views on this, that if we criticise, say, the Israeli government, and it's just a criticism of the government like all other governments, the inclination is for people to come out and say, no, you're anti-Semitic. And I think that's wrong. And I think that's where we need to have this conversation to say, no, everybody's open to criticism, but we've got to keep the hatred part of it.
So broadly, I would say I support the Gillian Siegel report with a few caveats. It contains some really, really good things, like what we've spoken about, immigration, calling for conditions on people before they're granted visas to make sure we're not bringing in hateful people to deport them once we have, before they become citizens. Some of the other great suggestions are that taxpayer funding should not be going towards arts organizations or any organizations that are spreading anti-Semitism and hate. I think it's Australians' money. We don't have to fund it. Other areas like focusing on what's going on in the universities, some of these radical things being taught, I think are important. Some of the suggestions are they're okay either way. I mean, more education of the Holocaust, that's not going to hurt if students learn about that. It's important. But when it comes to some of the areas around what we've spoken about, hate speech, I'd say we need to approach that quite carefully, as for the reasons I've said before, that it is quite subjective. We don't want to be policing, like they do in the UK, speech that may offend someone or insult someone. But when it comes to one of the important things in the Siegel report is that it brings in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So it's important to have a definition so we know what we're working with. And I think the definition provides some really clear examples to show that criticism of Israel is obviously allowed. Criticism of the Israeli government is fine. I mean, Israelis are very, very critical of their own government. You see some of the largest protests there. And the Australian Jewish community is also quite critical at times of the Israeli government. But what it provides specific examples. So, for example, holding Australian Jews responsible for the conduct of the Israeli government, that's considered anti-Semitism. Treating the state of Israel, the world's only Jewish state, in a different way than you would treat every other state, that's anti-Semitic. So once we have clear examples like that, what we've seen in the streets, these protests that we saw over the last couple of years, of course, many of the people attended for genuine reasons. They were upset by images they saw in the media about what was happening in Gaza. But it's telling that, there's tens of thousands of people have died in Sudan, for just as one example, in the last few months, yet we don't see anyone on the street. So we need to ask ourselves, why is there this one issue that motivates some people so much that they get so involved in the world's only Jewish state? But yeah, all in all, I would say it's a very good report. The problem is that it's been sitting on the Prime Minister's desk since July. He hasn't done anything about it. And now because this terrible thing has happened, he's going to rush and just implement everything rather than having carefully considered each section and implementing the good sections as he should have done many months ago.
Just while you're here, why is it that people have, and you mentioned, there's been tens of thousands killed in other parts of the world. Why is it that the world is focusing, not the world, a piece of the Western civilization or civilization is focusing on Israel and Gaza? And you're quite right. There have been and continuing atrocities around the world at the moment. Why is it? And part two, there's always two parts of my questions, because I find it very odd, by the way, that we don't talk about the other terrible things happening in the world. And then if we do report on those things, many times it is tarnished with it's my opinion. That's the truth. Always tell the truth. But what's gone wrong with because this country, I mean, I've got to tell you, we have some very good friends who are Jewish friends, and my wife has always worked with in the clothing industry, and we never thought of people being Anglican, Buddhist, whatever, Jewish. They're always Australian, whether I was a bit odd, which some would say so. But I'm just wondering how this all went pear-shaped, because up until a few years ago, it was a very good country to live in. And even though you may not agree with the politics, but it was a great country to live in. We were always very tolerant. And at the end of the day, you'd say, let's go and have a beer and talk about it later. But now that seems to have gone. The great Australian character has gone. So where do we go? Where did the change come? How come we focus on what's happening and it is when if you get involved in what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Israel, what happened on October 6th and stuff, atrocities all around. But why the focus? And where have we gone wrong in Australia, Robert?
Well, I think Israel, for many people, represents it's the epitome of it's a Western country. It's where the Judeo-Christian values are born. So there's a lot of people that hate that. It's a country that is proud of its heritage, where religion plays a major role. So for some of these groups, for people like the Greens, for people who hate Western society, who hate Judeo-Christian values, this is the perfect example of it. It's sitting there in the Middle East. It's successful, it has a booming economy, it's strong militarily. So it's not fitting the stereotypes of what they want. And when we see in a lot of Western societies, which are tearing themselves apart with immigration, with self-hatred and these sort of things, you don't see that in Israel. It's the only Western country that has a replacement level birth rate. So people are having children, they're having families, doing normal things. And I think that it shows up. People in Europe don't like to see that. People in the West don't like to see that because it's challenging some of the traditional values. And it's a shame to see that imported into Australia. Australia has always been a very, very tolerant country. Jewish people came to Australia on the first fleet. They've been part of the country ever since. So John Monash, so many of our people who helped build this country. So we just want to return it to the way it has always been.
Yeah, I would agree, and you probably also would agree too, Gary. Because if we could just go back a few years, there was none of this garbage going on. It was, you pop down to like a Turkish place, or you pop down and have a drink with whoever you wanted to. Now it's become so contentious, and everyone's got an opinion. Where did it go wrong? When did it go wrong?
Well, let's concentrate. What went right? What went right is that we were a very Anglo, I'd say narrow-minded society until the 60s, 50s. And then millions of people came in from mainly Southern Europe, and we began to broaden our purview. But it wasn't particularly deep. It was all about, did you bring good food and all the rest of it. And then came the ideologies. And we didn't deal with it. We didn't deal with the discussions. And then came these brutal ideological fashions that said, we support the least successful people. So as Israel became more successful, it became diminished in the eyes of intellects. It's almost as simple as that. So the Israelis did brilliantly, have done, continue to do brilliantly well in a failed region, the Middle East. So they stand out like anything you think of that can stand out, right? And so they have, if you like, come to the attention of the great intellects that say they must be doing something wrong. They are oppressing some other group. Well, let's take the Palestinians. Well, let's take the Palestinians. They've had every opportunity to govern themselves and have failed. And rather than teach their children how to succeed, they teach them how to hate. And that, I think, sums it up. And we haven't done enough to talk to our children about that basic nonsense, this intellectual fashion that says you can no longer celebrate success, you can no longer celebrate democracy, you have to always look to the poor and the oppressed and never blame the poor and the oppressed. That's a shocking mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree. But where to now? I mean, it's Christmas time. We have on the 27th of December some new surveillance measures or protective measures. You have to log into Google and I think it's Bing, and others will soon follow. So that was snuck through. We have Mins in New South Wales, and also I see that Crucifili in Queensland is going to be even stronger than everybody else. We're going to stamp out anti-Semitism. Robert, does that make you feel uncomfortable that the rhetoric seems to have been ramped up from people who did nothing before?
I think it does. It's very hypocritical to see some of the people who've either encouraged this on, whether it's the ABC, whether it's certain commentators, or people within the federal government, now making the most of it. I think the Christopher government, I think, has been quite supportive in Queensland, but some of these other governments, to see them using this situation to implement the sort of measures and divisive measures, which you just know they've always wanted to do all along. This is their agenda to bring in, and to use this crisis to do that, instead of listening to the community, listening to how we could have prevented this and how we can prevent the next terrible thing like this. I think that's the way we've got to do this moving forward.
Gary, what do you think? Is it because I get very uncomfortable? I have to say, I get very uncomfortable when I hear people pointing a finger at anybody, and anybody they feel that has said something not so good, and they're either they have this thing called Islamophobia, or you're anti-Semitic. How do we wind back this rhetoric? How do we get back to being what we used to be like?
I think it may get worse before it gets better, but we're going to have to start with that. I find it a curiosity, actually, that Premier Mins was cheered. I think he's a very decent man, but nevertheless, he failed to break up those young Muslim men who, on October the 8th, 2023, gathered around the Opera House disgracefully. He failed to prevent a march over Sydney Harbour Bridge by people I would regard as my enemy. So he has not been on the ball. I think he's been strong now, but that's very late. Albanese is irrecoverable. I mean, he's not doing anything to assist. Where to from here? Don't be afraid to have the discussion. Don't be afraid to call things out. It could get a bit rough from here on in, but the goal is to not so much reclaim what we had 30, 40 years ago, but to rise above it and say, we're going to decide that Australia will be a more singular culture among many ethnicities. And we've got to set some rules, and we've got to work towards those rules and be more specific about those values that we want to promote and that we're prepared to argue for.
It would seem, Robert, as we are almost out of time here, for both you and Gary, it would seem that we have imported hate from the Middle East. Where do we go from here? Robert?
I think the most urgent thing is we're still bringing in hundreds of thousands of people, and obviously most of them are good, but with such a volume of people, there's no way to properly check who we're bringing in. So I think we need to lower the numbers, check people more carefully. As Gary was suggesting, maybe extend the amount of time that, to make sure we're giving citizenship to people who are going to be productive members of society, who are not going to continue this hatred. And I think it is recoverable, but we do need to see action now. If the government just leaves this now, I think Australia is looking at a very dark future. So the time to act is right now.
And Gary, you have the final 20 seconds.
Well, I agree with Robert on that. Let's be far more assertive in who we allow into the country. And that alone, I think, will send all sorts of signals that we won't tolerate intolerance and hatred within Australia, and we are not going to import it to the extent that we can judge it.
Robert Gregory, CEO of the Australian Jewish Association. I appreciate your time, and it is a terrible time, not just for the Jewish community. I think it's a terrible, terrible time for Australia, because at the end of the day, it's Australians fighting with Australians, and I think it's just abhorrent. So, as with everybody else, our hearts do go out to the Jewish community and to the Australian community. Dr. Gary Johns, the honorary Dr. Gary Johns from Close the Gap Research. Gary, I thank you for your considered answers and your participation. It's been very kind of you. You were one of the, I mean, I was thinking about it today and I thought, you were one of the good politicians.
Can I say, you've just insulted me twice by calling me the honorary doctor. It's honourable because I was a minister, and doctor because I got
Sorry about that. So, honourable. I'm looking at my teleprompter and I've called you the honorary. How wrong can I get?
Don't give them away.
I'll just call you Gary. Gary and Robert, thank you so much.
Much better.
Thank you, sir. Have a lovely week. Have a great Christmas. And we'll talk again in the very near future, I would imagine. This has been The Big Issue, and this is The World.